Hi guys, tonight we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycles. We've already discussed that feeding relationships link different parts of ecosystems because what you eat or what a consumer eats transfers sunlight energy, which is really important. And so from food we gain energy, but we also gain matter. So we use the energy, obviously, to power the activities that we do. But talking about the matter is a little bit trickier. Matter is used to make up what you are, all the stuff that you are. And so matter can include little micronutrients that are stored in plants and then transferred to you. And these micronutrients are used to build your DNA, or to take those DNA instructions and build proteins, and from all those proteins to build the organs and the tissues that make you what you are. So if you look at the term biogeochemical cycle, it can tell you a little bit about what we're talking about here. It's cycles that move through both the biotic and the abiotic or geo and chemical spaces in an ecosystem. The four cycles we're going to talk about today are nitrogen, water, carbon, and then lastly, but not least important, is the phosphorus cycle. In the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen comes in many different forms, and it's essential for plant growth and function. It's really available in the atmosphere. It makes up 78–79% of the atmosphere, but most of that atmospheric nitrogen is not actually usable by plants and animals. You can't breathe it in and use it to build your tissues or your DNA. Instead, we need these special bacteria that are in the soil, and they help fix nitrogen into usable form, a different chemical arrangement that we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about here, but it is available a little bit in your text and on some of the online resources. Bacteria fixing nitrogen is a fancy way of just saying changing it. They change it from the atmospheric form into a form that the plants can take up and then you can get. Lightning also does this, but in a really small percentage compared to the bacteria in the soil. So then once the plants have captured that nitrogen or the usable nitrogen in their roots and they've used it to build their plant tissues and different cellular structures that they need, you can then get that nitrogen from the plants as you eat them, or from something that's eaten those plants, like a burger, let's say. And then when animals and plants die, that nitrogen can be returned to the soil or the atmosphere in waste and dead tissue, and there's actually other bacteria that work on that process. Here's a really simplified picture that I like, because we're not going to spend a lot of time with the different forms of the way nitrogen moves through, but you can get a sense that there's just a ton of it in the atmosphere, and that bacteria in the soil are going to fix it and make it available to plants. Okay, this is the first step where a living or biotic component takes this biogeochemical cycle and converts it. The plants get it, and then they're the second biological thing, and then they transfer it on to animals, who then build it into their proteins, and then when they die, the nitrogen in the proteins gets released back. Here's a more complicated version. You do not need to know this one, but I put it here in case you'd like to see it in more detail. It has the different forms of nitrogen and the names of the different processes that make nitrogen either available to plants, or sometimes convert nitrogen back into the form found in the atmosphere. Again, you don't need to know these terms for what we're talking about, but it's just good to know that this is actually a pretty complicated process that we simplify. Let's talk about the water cycle. This is the one that most of us can label at this point right now. It's essential for maintaining homeostasis in your body. All plants and animals need some degree of water. You are made up of a lot of water. And it's funny, the atmosphere, which is where we think of a lot of water, is not actually made up of that much. Of the global water budget, so all the water available on the earth, a teeny fraction of that is in the atmosphere. And we know we can label most of these things, right? We can label condensation and evaporation and precipitation and runoff. But what we want to talk about is how this moves through biotic and abiotic parts. So the one part of this diagram that's not labeled is the water actually is taken up by plants, and then it's actually given off. So we'll talk about that in a second. Plants need water in their roots to survive. So they're going to take up that water from water trapped in the soil, and they're going to release water when they photosynthesize. Remember the equation for photosynthesis: you've taken some carbon dioxide, you've taken some water, and with sunlight energy, you can create carbohydrates and oxygen. Oxygen is plants' waste, right? So the plants have to let out this waste in the same way you have to let out your waste. And when they do this, when they let out that oxygen waste, water escapes into the atmosphere. And this process is called transpiration or evapotranspiration. I put this image in your notes just to kind of help you understand this. If you just pause for a second, this is really no different than you taking a big breath and releasing the breath. In the plants, they take in carbon dioxide and they take in some water and they create these sugars with it, right? And when they let out the oxygen, water vapor escapes from the same pores that they let out the oxygen in. So humans take in water stored in different places, fresh water. And they take it from lakes, rivers, and most of the water that we're getting on a global scale is actually from groundwater, or not most, but a large percentage. Water can also transport other nutrients, so it becomes really important when we talk about soil or when we talk about pollution, because water can move pollution as well. And I want you to think about all the ways that humans kind of add stuff to the water, whether it's runoff from streets or whether it's wastewater that you flush down your toilet or down your shower drain or rinsing off your driveway or your soapy car. We change the composition of water and how healthy water is in this cycle. So let's talk about the carbon cycle really quick. This is the third one we've talked about so far is carbon. And it's essential for producing sugars by the plants. We have to produce carbohydrates. And then animals are also going to give this off in respiration. When you take a deep breath, you're using that oxygen in the air, and then you're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere with water. So you can see how plants trap carbon, and then they either return it when they decay, or they transfer it to animals, who then release carbon back into the atmosphere. Okay. Fossil fuels are then just made up of really, really old, like hundreds of millions of year old plants and animals. And when we extract this fossil fuels, we're basically releasing stored carbon. And so humans increase the amount of carbon in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, because it's basically like a bank of carbon, or by changing the trees. We call this land use change, but let's say you chop down all these trees. Well, those trees are holding on to carbon as well, and so they can release a lot of their carbon as they're changed or burned, or the litter that's left over decomposes. The fourth cycle we're going to talk about is phosphorus. Phosphorus is an element that's incredibly important to you because, as you remember from our DNA song, it's in your DNA and your RNA. Without phosphorus, we can't do a lot of the essential functions. Even photosynthesis can't occur without phosphorus, even though we don't think of it as being essential yet. But this is a unique cycle because it doesn't have any atmospheric component. Unlike all the others that go into the atmosphere and are usually released in breath or by the stomata of plants, phosphorus is totally out of the atmosphere. Most phosphorus is released in very slow time, long geologic time from erosion of rocks or landforms, and it's taken in small quantities by plants, okay, and then transferred to organisms that eat the plants, like the cows here eating the grass that has phosphorus from the soil. Okay, so it's transferred to organisms through feeding relationships. Like nitrogen, I know if you're following along in the notes, you might have thought I skipped that last bullet point on nitrogen, but like nitrogen, phosphorus is considered a limiting factor because its availability limits how much of this plant growth can grow. So if a lot of times when you're gardening or if you're in an ecosystem, especially aquatic ones, if you have more nitrogen, you have more growth. And same is true as phosphorus oftentimes is if you have more phosphorus, you have more growth. So humans often add phosphorus in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that we do this is that because it's a limiting factor, we add it to our crops and fertilizers so that we get a lot more crops. And sometimes that washes off into rivers and streams. Sometimes we mine it so that we can produce fertilizers, and that when water hits that and goes into streams and lakes, it can carry the phosphorus with it. And what happens is when this phosphorus ends up in the system, because it's no longer limiting or in a limited supply, it increases the production of plants like algae. Well, algae grow really rapidly and eventually they block out the sun from other plants and eventually they can't support themselves anymore. They die, and as they decompose, they suck the oxygen out of the water. This process where we add phosphorus or nitrogen, it increases plant growth, but then as those plants decompose, it decreases oxygen, and it basically can destroy aquatic ecosystems. Is called eutrophication. You probably want to write on your notes that some of the causes of eutrophication in addition to this are come in your soaps. You can look and see if your soaps at home, like your dishwashing soap or your laundry detergent, says phosphorus free on it, because that's another really common way that we get extra phosphorus in our aquatic ecosystems. Here's a better picture of eutrophication if you're interested, just to kind of help keep track of it. You've got this big algae bloom. As the algae die off and they decay, that basically sucks out the oxygen from the habitat. If you think you understand the 4 biogeochemical cycles that we've talked about today, a really quick check for your understanding would be to be able to fill out this table here. For each of the 4 cycles, you should be able to tell a little bit about the importance to both the ecosystem and especially the biotic parts or living parts of the ecosystem, identify a few of those, and then tell me one way that humans are changing this cycle and making it different. We will talk about this check for understanding for class, so if you don't understand it, I'd go back and check your chapter readings or watch the video one more time. Great job!